Power rarely exists in isolation. It rarely survives as a single individual or a single location. Power attaches itself to structure. It embeds itself inside systems that can persist even when individuals disappear. And by the mid-2000s, the structure expanding across Europe was no longer centered on nightlife alone. It was no longer confined to the doors of exclusive clubs or the velvet rope economies of major cities. It had begun to align itself with something older, something more disciplined, something built for endurance. It was biker infrastructure. Outlaw motorcycle clubs had already spent decades building their presence across Europe. Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Belgium, Austria. These weren't temporary groups. They were permanent structures, organizations built around identity, loyalty, and internal hierarchy. To outsiders, they appeared as social clubs centered around motorcycles. But internally, they operated with defined ranks, defined responsibilities, defined authority. Each chapter functioned as part of a larger network. Connected but not dependent. Independent but not isolated. They were designed to expand. Expansion inside outlaw motorcycle organizations follows a precise pattern. It does not happen suddenly. It does not happen randomly. It begins quietly. First, a support club forms. A smaller group aligned with an established organization. Support clubs serve as extensions. They build presence locally. They demonstrate loyalty. They prove reliability. If that support club demonstrates discipline and stability, it may eventually receive probationary status. This is the next phase. A probationary chapter operates under observation. Its leadership is evaluated. Its internal cohesion is tested. Its ability to maintain structure is monitored. Only after passing through these stages can a chapter receive full recognition, full status, full integration into the broader organization. Each step requires internal approval. Each step requires trust. Because expansion is never accidental. It is strategic. Inside outlaw motorcycle culture, symbols carry meaning. Patches represent identity, but they also represent authority. They signal rank, position, recognition. They communicate structure without words. And behind those symbols exists an internal order that is rarely explained publicly. Leadership exists, but it is rarely announced. Authority exists, but it is rarely documented. Recognition happens internally, and internally it matters. During this same period, investigative conversations across Europe began referencing another location with increasing frequency: Turkey. Geographically, Turkey occupies a unique position. It connects Europe and Asia. It sits between established Western jurisdictions and emerging regional influence. It has long served as a bridge, a crossroads of movement, commerce, and culture. But in investigative contexts, geography can also create strategic advantage. It creates distance. It creates jurisdictional complexity. It creates environments where influence can evolve differently, not outside visibility, but outside uniform enforcement frameworks. This is where the story intersects again. Following deportation from Germany, Necati Arabaci was now physically located in Turkey. His presence there marked a shift in geography. But geography alone does not define influence. Influence follows networks. And investigative reporting during the late 2000s increasingly referenced the steady development of biker club structures in Turkey. Not as a sudden expansion, not as a visible takeover, but as gradual consolidation, support structures forming, chapters appearing, connections strengthening, quietly, consistently. Inside outlaw motorcycle organizations, authority rarely requires public declaration. It requires internal acceptance. Leadership is not defined by press conferences. It is not defined by public titles. It is defined by recognition within the structure itself. Recognition built through reputation, through history, through demonstrated strength, through loyalty over time. Influence moves quietly, often without formal acknowledgement, often without written confirmation. But inside the organization, it is understood. For law enforcement agencies, this structure creates a unique challenge. Traditional criminal organizations often leave behind clear evidence of hierarchy, corporate records, financial ownership, signed agreements, formal leadership positions. But outlaw motorcycle organizations operate differently. Their structure is rigid internally, but unofficial externally. Authority exists without paperwork. Control exists without contracts. Influence exists without signatures. This makes attribution difficult. Proving direct leadership becomes complex, because influence does not require formal declaration. It exists through patterns, through consistent presence, through association across multiple chapters, through internal recognition. By the late 2000s, European investigations increasingly focused on the international coordination of outlaw motorcycle clubs. Authorities began analyzing patterns, financial flows, chapter expansion, regional alliances. They were no longer looking at isolated local groups. They were examining networks that operated across borders, networks that adapted to enforcement pressure, networks that expanded through structure rather than visibility. Turkey remained part of these investigative conversations, not as an isolated location, but as part of a broader network dynamic, a location connected to ongoing structural development. And investigative reporting continued referencing names already known from earlier organized crime cases, names connected to prior influence, prior leadership, prior authority. This reflects a broader reality about organized crime structures. They evolve, they adapt, they transition, they rarely remain confined to a single sector. Nightlife provides access. Logistics provides infrastructure. Infrastructure provides durability. Durability allows expansion. And expansion creates networks that persist beyond individual locations. What begins in one city can extend across continents. What begins in nightlife can transition into something far more structured, something designed to endure. The European expansion of outlaw motorcycle organizations was not simply about motorcycles. Motorcycles were symbols, but the structure beneath them was something more complex. It was about network density, strategic chapter placement, regional coordination, maintaining cohesion across geographic distance, maintaining internal stability across national borders. This level of coordination does not happen automatically. It requires experienced individuals, individuals whose reputations carry weight, individuals recognized within the organization, individuals whose influence exists whether publicly acknowledged or not. This is where the story becomes difficult to measure. Public records can document arrests. They can document convictions. They can document deportations. Investigative reporting can document associations. But internal recognition inside outlaw motorcycle organizations operates differently. It is not recorded in public databases. It is not announced publicly. It is understood internally. And that internal recognition often determines real influence. Not titles, not official statements. Recognition, silence, presence. By the end of the 2000s, the narrative surrounding Necati Arabaci had transformed. This was no longer simply the story of a nightclub operator in Cologne. It had become part of a broader examination of organized structure, an examination of how outlaw motorcycle organizations expand, how they maintain cohesion, how influence persists even when individuals change location, how authority can exist without formal declaration, how leadership can exist without public acknowledgement, because power does not always require visibility. Sometimes visibility weakens it. Sometimes visibility invites disruption. But influence that operates quietly, influence embedded inside structure, influence recognized internally, can persist far longer, far beyond public attention, far beyond geographic relocation. Season 1 is now approaching its final chapter, and Episode 5 will examine the most difficult question of all. What defines leadership inside organizations where titles are rarely spoken, where authority is understood internally, but rarely declared publicly, where influence exists not in documents, but in recognition. Empires in the shadows do not announce their borders. They expand quietly, and they endure.